Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was a typical Friday night, the kind where the world outside feels still and quiet, like the entire neighborhood is tucked away in its own little world. I live in a two-bedroom house in a quiet part of California, far enough from the hustle and bustle of the city to feel safe, yet close enough to everything so I don't feel isolated. The house itself isn't much, simple, cozy, with beige walls and hardwood floors that creak whenever you walk across them. It's the kind of house you can lose yourself in, but I loved it. I'd been living here alone for about 6 months now, and the routine was comforting. That night, I had planned to do what I usually do, unwind after a busy week. I started with a simple dinner, spaghetti with marinara sauce, nothing fancy, but it hit the spot. I wasn't feeling too tired, so I decided to curl up on the couch afterward, put on a movie, and just relax. The house was still, the only sounds being the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional car passing by on the road outside. By 11:30 p.m., the movie had finished, and I decided it was time to turn in for the night. I felt that familiar weight of exhaustion creeping in, the kind that only a full day's work can bring. I turned off the TV and switched off the lights, letting the quiet darkness envelop the room. The air had turned cool, and the faint rustle of the trees outside seemed to whisper in the night breeze. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, as I always did when I felt a little cold. I turned on my side, facing the window, and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet. But then, something happened. Something I'll never forget. I woke up suddenly, but not because I heard something or saw something move. It was more of an instinctual feeling, the kind of wake-up that hits you when something is wrong, when your body knows before your mind catches up. I sat up in bed, feeling disoriented at first, my heart already beginning to race. I glanced around the room, confused, trying to figure out why I was awake. The room was dark and everything seemed still. But then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, almost like a whisper of sound, the kind of noise you could easily chalk up to your imagination or the creak of the house settling. But no, these steps were deliberate. There was a rhythm to them, an unmistakable pattern. Step, step, step. I felt a chill race up my spine, my body going rigid with fear. The sound wasn't coming from the street. It wasn't from any of the neighbors walking outside or a car driving by. These footsteps were coming from outside my window, just a few feet away from the wall of my bedroom. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, almost as if by not moving, I could make the situation disappear. My mind was running through every possible explanation, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat ringing in my ears as I lay there, frozen under the covers, waiting for the next sound. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, as if whoever was out there was just walking back and forth near my window. It felt like time slowed down in those moments. I could feel every second dragging out, each step outside increasing the tension in the pit of my stomach. The weirdest thing was, it wasn't just a random sound. It wasn't a passing car or an animal. It was deliberate, and the person didn't seem to be in a hurry, almost like they were waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to get up to do something, anything, but I didn't dare move. What if they saw me? What if they knew I was awake? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe someone lost or looking for something, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I felt it in my gut, the kind of primal fear that's hard to shake. This wasn't just a coincidence. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, listening closely, hoping the silence meant they were leaving. But then I heard it again. The footsteps started again, and this time they were closer. Much closer. I could feel my pulse quicken. Whoever it was had moved from the yard near my window to the back of the house. The backyard is dark at night, shadowed by trees that stretch up high against the sky. But in the pitch-black darkness, I could hear the distinct sound of someone walking. It was so unnervingly clear, like they were right on the other side of my bedroom wall. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stay here in bed and wait for them to come inside, but I couldn't run either. The thought of confronting them or opening the door in the middle of the night was too terrifying. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any possible escape, any way to make sure I was safe. But before I could think of anything, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door handle being turned. The door was locked, I was sure of it. But the rattling, the faint creaking sound of it being jiggled was clear. Someone was trying to get in. My chest tightened and I fought to control my breathing, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I had to act fast. The door rattled again, and then I heard a thud, soft, like the person had pushed against it in frustration, as if they weren't able to get inside right away. It wasn't enough to knock the door down, but it sent a clear message. They wanted in. I knew they weren't going to give up easily. That thought hit me hard. I'm alone. There's no one else here. No one to help me. It's just me, in the dark, with someone outside trying to break in. I moved quickly, heart pounding in my chest, sweat running down my neck. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't risk them hearing me. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling as I unlocked it and dialed 911. The operator picked up almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? She asked, her voice calm, but I could hear the slight urgency in it. Someone's outside my back door. I think they're trying to break in, I whispered, my voice shaky. Stay calm, she said, her voice steady. Can you tell me your address, and are you in immediate danger? I rattled off my address, my fingers fumbling with the numbers on the screen. I couldn't think straight. Every sound outside was amplified, each footstep, each rustle in the dark. Listen to me, she continued, her voice firm now. I need you to stay hidden. Don't confront them. We've already sent someone your way, but stay out of sight until help arrives. Do you understand? Yes, I stammered. My breath caught in my throat. I had to stay hidden. I couldn't make a noise. But what if they heard me? What if they came in anyway? I didn't have time to dwell on those thoughts. I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door handle rattling again. My mind was racing, trapped in the noise of that rattling door. I could hear the faint sound of the lock clicking as they applied pressure, slowly forcing the door open. The back door creaked. I could hear it. The faintest of sounds as the wood gave way to their persistent tugging. This was it. They were in. They were inside. I didn't know what to do. The back door was open now. I could hear them stepping inside. The unmistakable creak of boots on wood echoed through the house, signaling that they were moving farther in. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. My hands were so cold I could barely hold it, but I gripped it tight. The bat felt heavier than it had ever felt before, its wooden surface smooth and reassuring in my hands. But the weight of what was happening pressed down on me. The footsteps were coming closer, slowly, but there was no mistaking their intent. They were coming to my room. I held my breath, trying to make myself as quiet as possible. The air around me felt thick, as if time itself was dragging its feet. I didn't know if I could handle another second of this. My hands were trembling, my legs starting to shake. The door to my bedroom creaked open. I didn't think. I just reacted. My body moved on its own. I swung the bat with everything I had, with all the fear and adrenaline running through me. There was a sickening thud when the bat collided with his head. He crumpled immediately, his body hitting the floor with a soft thud. I stood over him, breathing hard, my pulse still racing. My hands were slick with sweat, but I couldn't move. I stared at him, lying unconscious on the floor. I had just hit someone. What now? I didn't know what to do. Should I check if he was still breathing? Should I leave? But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The operator's voice was still coming through the phone, a soft murmur in the background, but I didn't hear the words. I couldn't. I could only hear the sound of my own heartbeat, still so loud in my ears. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only minutes. I couldn't bring myself to leave my bedroom. I stayed in the corner, crouched behind the bed, just waiting. The silence in the house was overwhelming. When the police finally came, I could hear their voices, and I felt a rush of relief wash over me. They took control immediately, checking on the man, making sure he was safely apprehended and unconscious. It wasn't until later that I learned the full details. The man had been stalking me for weeks. He had broken in through the back door, the one I thought was locked. The police said he had a criminal record, a long one. He had a history of home invasions and robberies, and this wasn't his first attempt. He'd been caught before, but somehow he was out again. The officer told me I did the right thing, that I had defended myself. "He's lucky you got to him first," the officer said. "It could have turned out much worse." And while I appreciated that, the truth still weighed heavy on my chest. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I was just an ordinary person, living in an ordinary house. I didn't realize how vulnerable I really was. I didn't sleep much that night, and I still haven't slept the same since. The thought of someone being that close to me, to my life, it shakes me to my core. I never thought much of it when I first moved into this little house. It was a small, single-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood in California, just far enough outside the city that it felt peaceful but not too isolated. It had a warm, cozy vibe, with pale beige walls and smooth wooden floors that creaked a little underfoot, adding to its charm. The kind of place that makes you feel safe, at ease, like nothing could go wrong. I'd been looking for something like this for a while, a fresh start after a long, exhausting period in my life. It was my first time living alone, and I was excited to finally have a place to call my own. But I never imagined that my new chapter would begin this way. The house had all the typical quirks you'd expect from a place built in the 80s. Small closets, slightly uneven floors, and windows that didn't always close properly. But it was mine, and I was happy to be there. I'd spent the first few days unpacking and setting things up, getting used to the sound of the wind rattling the trees outside and the hum of the streetlights at night. It felt like a good place to be. It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel uneasy. It was just a weird, inexplicable feeling that came over me, like I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it at first. After all, I was alone, and I had no reason to feel paranoid. I figured it was just the unfamiliarity of the new surroundings. I hadn't yet grown accustomed to the creaks and groans of an older home settling as it adjusted to the cooler nighttime air. It was a Sunday evening when it all started. The house was quiet, and I had just finished tidying up after a long day of organizing and unpacking the last few boxes. The living room had finally started to look like an actual home. Pictures on the walls, a comfy couch in the corner, and a small TV on the stand. The kitchen smelled faintly of the dinner I'd made earlier, though the scent was already fading as the evening wore on. I decided it was time for a shower. I had been planning to take one earlier in the day, but everything had gotten away from me. The bathroom was small, just big enough for a single person, with beige tiles and a simple glass shower stall. There was a thin white plastic curtain that I always had trouble keeping inside the tub. I had taken a shower in that same bathroom for the past few days without any issues, but tonight it felt different. The air in the bathroom felt colder than usual, even though I hadn't turned on the fan. I shook it off, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water hit my skin, relaxing the tension in my shoulders. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the water run over my head, but then something caught my attention. I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door opening. It was faint at first, almost like a soft creak, but it was enough to make me pause. I stood there, frozen under the warm water, trying to process what I'd just heard. The sound of the door opening was so specific, like the way it always creaked when you turned the knob. My heart began to race. I'm sure I locked it, I thought to myself. I always lock it when I come home. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more doubt crept in. My mind started spinning. Maybe I'd been distracted when I came in. Maybe I had forgotten. It wasn't impossible, after all. I had been unpacking all day, bouncing from room to room, setting up furniture and organizing things. But the thought that someone could be in my house, the idea that I might not have locked the door properly, sent a chill running down my spine. I stood still for a few seconds, listening. The house was quiet now, but the silence felt too still, too unnatural. The faint sound of the door opening still lingered in my ears. My mind raced as I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it wasn't the front door at all. Maybe it was just the house creaking and settling, as houses do at night. But I knew deep down that something was wrong. I pulled back the shower curtain and grabbed the towel that was hanging just outside the stall. My hands were shaking as I wrapped it around myself, moving as quietly as I could. I didn't want to make any noise, didn't want to alert whoever might be there that I was awake. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just ignore it. I had to check. I crept out of the bathroom, feeling the cool air of the hallway brush against my wet skin. The house was unnervingly quiet now. The water had stopped running, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. I made my way to the end of the hallway, where the front door was. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but something inside me told me I needed to look. As I reached the living room, I noticed that the front door was ajar. It wasn't wide open, but it was slightly cracked. My heart skipped a beat. Did I leave it like that? I couldn't remember. I was sure I had locked it earlier, but this wasn't the time for second guessing. I stayed in the living room for a few moments, my body tensed like a wire ready to snap. The door, with its soft crack, seemed to beckon me, drawing me closer. I could hear a faint shuffling sound, soft footsteps that seemed to move just outside my line of sight. My throat tightened and I held my breath. I could feel my heart thudding against my ribs, so loud I was sure anyone nearby would hear it. I had to be imagining things. I had to be. But the footsteps grew louder. Someone's inside. I didn't know who, but I knew I was in danger. My entire body went cold and panic began to take hold. My first instinct was to run, to get out of the house, to call for help, but my legs felt heavy as though they were weighed down by concrete. I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do next, but everything felt like it was happening too quickly. I retreated into the bathroom, hoping that whoever it was hadn't noticed me yet. I pressed my back against the bathroom door, trying to make myself as small as possible. My hands gripped the edges of the towel, my knuckles turning white as I tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence now was even worse. It was thick, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Then, just as I thought I might pass out from the tension, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a reflection. This was a solid, dark figure, moving just outside the bathroom door. My breath caught in my throat and my blood ran cold. This wasn't some random noise. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone was in my house and they were moving closer. I wanted to scream, to shout out for help, but I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in place, trapped in my own body as the shadow moved just outside the bathroom. It was so close I could hear the faint sound of fabric brushing against the floor, the soft measured pace of someone stalking through my house. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even closed properly. I had been too careless, too distracted. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I knew I had to get out. I had to act now. I made a run for it. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just bolted toward the back door, my wet feet slipping on the floor as I tried to gain traction. But just as I reached the door, my foot caught on the edge of a rug. My body lurched forward, and I crashed hard into the side table, my head slamming into the edge. Pain shot through my skull, and I felt everything go black for a moment. The world spun around me. I could taste blood in my mouth as I struggled to get up, but I was dizzy. I couldn't focus. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. That's when I heard it. A voice. A neighbor's voice. I don't know how, but somehow through the fog of my disorientation, I heard my neighbor yell, "Hey, are you okay?" The words were muffled but unmistakable. They must have heard the struggle, the scream. They must have called the cops. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of sirens getting louder and louder as they approached. A few moments later, I felt someone pulling me up from the ground, their strong hands steadying me as they helped me out of the house. The cool night air hit my face, and I was finally able to breathe again. The man who had broken in was caught not long after. The police had arrived just in time. I later found out he had picked the lock on my front door and slipped inside. He knew I was living alone, and for whatever reason, he'd decided to make his move. The police said that if my neighbor hadn't called the cops when they did, I might not have been so lucky. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. But I do know this. I lock every door and window now, every single time, because I don't ever want to feel that kind of terror again. I remember that evening so clearly, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, the last vestiges of daylight slipping away, and the chill of night started to settle into the air, just enough to raise goosebumps on my skin. I had recently moved into a cabin in the woods of Northern California, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The cabin is small, nestled deep in a forested area, and I loved the solitude it offered. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I preferred it. The peace, the quiet, the absence of anyone else. It was like a retreat for my mind. No distractions, no noise, just the wind rustling through the trees and the sound of the evening birds. I had been living there for a few weeks when I decided to go for a late afternoon hike. It was getting close to twilight, and I had no plans except to enjoy the outdoors and clear my head. The trails were familiar to me by then. I'd hiked them several times before. Nothing strenuous, just a simple, calm walk through the woods, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The kind of hike where you could let your mind wander and forget about the world. I packed my small backpack, just some water, a couple of snacks, and my phone in case of emergency. Not that I thought I would need it. I had the cabin to myself, but I had always been cautious about hiking alone. You never know what could happen, even in a place as peaceful as this. It's not that I was afraid of the woods. I was used to it, but the idea of getting lost, or worse, was always in the back of my mind. I set off around 5:30 p.m. The air was crisp, and the sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting everything in a golden, amber glow. The trail started out easy enough, just a soft dirt path with patches of exposed roots that crunched underfoot. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I walked. Everything was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. The cool breeze against my face felt soothing, like the woods were embracing me. About a mile in, the trail started to get steeper. The trees grew thicker, and the light began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows. It was still beautiful, though, with occasional breaks in the trees offering glimpses of the valley below, now softened by the fading light. I paused at one of those clearings, leaning against a tree for a moment to catch my breath and take in the view, knowing that soon enough it would be too dark to see anything. That's when I first saw him. At first, it wasn't anything alarming, just a figure in the distance. I didn't even think much of it. There were other trails that looped through this part of the forest, so I assumed he was another hiker. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out many details. Just a man, tall and thin, walking in my direction. I shrugged it off, figuring I'd pass him soon enough. It wasn't uncommon to see other people on the trails, but something about the way he was walking caught my attention. He wasn't moving like a normal hiker. There was a stiffness to his gait, as if he was deliberately trying to stay out of sight. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at the back of my mind. But every time I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw him still there, moving slowly but steadily behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, following me. My heart rate picked up and I started walking faster. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe he was just out for a walk too. Maybe he was just enjoying the quiet of the woods like I was. But the further I walked, the more it felt like he was keeping his distance on purpose. Like he didn't want to get too close, but he was still there, lingering behind me. The trail twisted and turned, and each time I looked behind, he was still there. Sometimes it seemed like he was moving a little bit closer. Other times, I'd walk for a while and then spot him in the distance again, as though he were waiting for me to move ahead. I told myself it was just a coincidence. People take different paces on hikes, right? Maybe he was just taking his time too. But my gut was telling me something wasn't right. After about another mile, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led to a rocky outcrop with a great view of the valley, and the other went deeper into the forest. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. That's when I saw him again, closer now. He had moved along the trail in a way that was almost deliberate, like he was waiting for me to make my decision. He was still a good distance away, but his movements were slower now, almost like he was studying me, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't about to let some random guy follow me around the woods without saying anything. It felt too wrong. So I picked up my pace again, walking faster down the rocky path toward the outcrop. I figured if I was just quicker, I'd put some distance between us. But when I glanced back, my stomach dropped. He was following me again, but this time he wasn't far behind. He was walking just a little faster now, moving with an eerie precision. I didn't stop. I just kept moving, my breath getting a little faster, the adrenaline starting to kick in. I was trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched, it was suffocating. It was like the whole forest had gone silent, as if everything else had stopped moving, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. I turned another corner, my eyes scanning the trees, trying to find some way to lose him. But no matter how fast I moved, he was still there, still behind me, keeping pace. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just hiking. He was following me. He wasn't lost. He wasn't just out for a walk. He had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't imagining it. And when I started to speed up, he did too. I broke into a jog, my feet slapping against the trail, kicking up dirt and pine needles. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. He was gaining on me. His footsteps were getting louder. I could hear them now, heavy, deliberate, moving faster with each step. My heart raced, the panic setting in. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up, but then I tripped. My foot caught on a loose branch hidden under a pile of leaves, and before I could react, I was on the ground, pain shooting up my leg as I scrambled to get back up. I could hear him now, Closer, too close. The sound of his footsteps, his breath, it was all too much. He reached me before I could stand. I felt his hand grab the strap of my backpack, jerking me back. I tried to hold on to it, but his grip was unrelenting, pulling me down. Panic flooded my chest, and I kicked out, hitting him as hard as I could. My foot connected with his chest, and I heard him grunt in pain. But he didn't let go. He yanked harder, and I felt my slipping, my legs buckling under me. My mind raced as I fought for control, trying to break free. I managed to kick again, this time knocking his hand off the strap, just enough for me to wriggle away. Without thinking, I bolted. I don't know how long I ran for, but it felt like an eternity. My legs burned with exhaustion, my body screaming for rest, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't stop. I finally made it back to the cabin, the sky now completely dark, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged, and I sank against it, trying to catch my breath. The first thing I did was grab my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the park ranger's office. I explained what had happened, how the man had followed me through the woods, his strange, deliberate movements, and how I'd felt his presence growing closer with each step I took. I described how he'd waited for me at the trail fork, how his gait had shifted as I sped up, how his grip had seized my backpack with unnerving force when I tripped. My fear was palpable, but I pressed on, detailing every unsettling moment. The ranger assured me someone would be sent to check the area, but I couldn't stop pacing the cabin, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every shadow outside, every whisper of wind felt like he was still out there, watching. After what felt like an eternity, the ranger finally called back. They'd searched the trail thoroughly, walked it up and down, but found nothing. No sign of the man, no footprints, no trace of him at all. It was as though he had never been there. I felt a hollow unease as the ranger's tone turned dismissive, offering to keep an eye on the area, but clearly unconcerned. I didn't know what had really happened that day. I didn't know if I'd narrowly escaped a robbery or if something far more malevolent had been at work. All I knew was that the woods felt different now, darker somehow, and I've never set foot on that trail again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.